Top 10 Worst Moments in DC Comics. Number 10. Superman makes an adult film with Big Barda. Yes, you read that right. Superman once starred in an adult film. To kick off this list, we feature one of the most notorious stories to ever star DC's most famous character, Superman. The story involves characters from legendary comic book artist Jack Kirby's Fourth World saga. Chief among them is Big Barda, a new god from the planet Apokolips. She was trained from a young age to be a fierce warrior for Darkseid, the evil despot ruler of the planet. However, she escaped after falling in love with another new god, Mr. Miracle, a master escape artist. Big Barda was a rough and tough heroine who wore the proverbial pants in her relationship with Mr. Miracle. She was fiercely loyal and protective of her husband. However, in John Byrne's otherwise stellar run on Action Comics, she was hypnotized and forced into doing an adult film by a villain appropriately known as Sleaze. Her partner, none other than the Man of Steel himself. Of course, the story goes that Superman woke up from his hypnosis before he could do the deed, but the damage was done. Superman, the paradigm of everything good and decent, and Big Barda, one of the toughest and most competent female characters in comics, were adult film stars. Jack Kirby, the creator of Big Barda, particularly hated the story. That might have something to do with the fact that he modelled her personality after his own wife. Keep it classy, John Byrne. Number 9. Emerald Twilight. Green Lantern Volume 3, numbers 48 to 50, January 1994 to March 1994. By the mid-90s, Hal Jordan, the second Green Lantern, and by far the most well-known, had fallen out of favour with DC's brass. They decided it was time to retire Hal in order for another new character, Kyle Rayner, to take his place. So how did DC decide to end the career of one of their most beloved heroes? By turning him into a genocidal villain. As part of the Reign of Superman storyline, which occurred after the highly publicized death of Superman, Hal's home of Coast City was completely destroyed by the villains Mongol and Cyborg Superman. As a result, the city was demolished and its 7 million inhabitants killed. The turn of events made Hal go completely insane. He believed that if he could steal all the main power battery's energy, the source of the Green Lantern rings, he could permanently rebuild Coast City. To do so, he killed all of the remainder of the Green Lantern Corps and the villain Sinestro. Afterwards, he became the villain Parallax. To DC's credit, they later redeemed Hal by having him sacrifice his life to restart the sun during the Final Night storyline and revealing that his madness had been caused by being possessed by an entity made of fear. Hal would later go on to reform the Green Lantern Corps, thanks to the expert guidance of writer Jeff Johns. But Emerald Twilight, the 3 issues where Hal went insane and killed the old corpse, remains a black spot on DC's legacy. Number 8. Superman at Earth's End. Superman at Earth's End original graphic novel, 1995. Superman at Earth's End is a one-shot, Elseworld story that takes place outside of established DC Comics canon. It is a sequel to a miniseries, which was in and of itself a spin-off of the DC Comics series Kamandi, a story about a young hero in a post-apocalyptic future ruled by hyper-evolved animals. Even better, originally, Kamandi was created after DC Comics was unable to secure the rights to the Planet of the Apes franchise. So Superman at Earth's End is a sequel to a spin-off based on a rip-off. Trust me, the story is even stupider than it sounds. To keep things simple, Superman is stranded in a post-apocalyptic future where an evil organization called the DNA Dictators, led by the twin clones of Adolf Hitler, have stolen Bruce Wayne's body in an attempt to create a mutated Batman creature. To stop them, Superman shoots the Hitlers with a quadruple chain gun called the Expunger, one of the most ridiculous and implausible weapons ever created. It's a poorly written, terribly executed piece of drivel that has Superman acting completely out of character. Even worse, it makes no sense. Even though it isn't official DC Comics canon, it's still one of the worst stories to ever feature Superman. Number 7. The Dark Knight Strikes Again. The Dark Knight Strikes Again, numbers 1 through 3, November 2001 to July 2002. Frank Miller's Batman The Dark Knight Returns helped revive the flagging comic book industry of the late 80s with its gripping storytelling and innovative take on the character. In it, an aged and retired Bruce Wayne is forced to take up the cowl again against a series of evils plaguing Gotham City. To this day, it is considered one of the greatest graphic novels in history, so it was inevitable that a sequel would be written. What nobody could predict was how indescribably bad it would be. First off, the art is atrocious. Frank Miller is usually a very competent artist, but here his art just looks ugly. But even bad art can be forgiven for a good story. Too bad The Dark Knight Strikes Again is also incredibly poorly written. In the first book, Batman was a grizzled and cynical loner. In The Dark Knight Strikes Again, he comes off like a hate-filled madman. Not to mention that the comic barely features him. Miller takes more time focusing on Superman, Wonder Woman, and the other members of the Justice League than he does on the book's significant character. The first book was revolutionary. This book comes off as immature, sexist, and blatantly disrespectful towards all of its characters and their legacies. Number 6. Identity Crisis. Identity Crisis, numbers 1 through 7, June 2004 to December 2004. During the mid-2000s, DC hit quite a few bumps in the road in terms of major events and crossovers. By that I mean they were almost exclusively terrible and insulting. One of the best examples was Identity Crisis. It was a disaster of an event. To truly understand the travesty that is Identity Crisis, you need to know who the Dibneys were. Ralph Dibney was a superhero called the Elongated Man who could stretch and shape his body however he wanted. However, he was best known for his great detective work. He was also married to Sue Dibney. Even though she didn't have any powers, she was a beloved member of the superhero community. The two were a breath of fresh air in comics, a happy, devoted married couple who were always cheerful, even when things got tough. They were both cheerleaders and proud members of the Justice League, as well as perennial fan favorites. So what does Identity Crisis do? It starts with Sue being brutally murdered and her corpse being burnt to a crisp. If that wasn't bad enough, it is revealed that Dr. Light, a cheesy villain who regularly fought the Teen Titans, had once raped her on the JLA satellite. To make matters even worse, the sorceress Zatanna mind-wiped Dr. Light and changed his personality, basically the equivalent of a full frontal lobotomy. Then she turned around and mind-wiped Batman to prevent him from protesting her actions. But it gets worse. The series thought it alright to randomly kill off the superhero Firestorm and Tim Drake's, Robin's, father. It was a mean, ugly, unpleasant series that didn't accomplish anything more than needlessly killing off several beloved characters and having all of the others act grossly out of character. Number 5. All-Star Batman and Robin the Wonder Boy. All-Star Batman and Robin the Wonder Boy, numbers 1 through 10, September 2005 to August 2008. Frank Miller has become something of a joke in the comic community. He was once one of the most original and talented members of the comic book community. As previously mentioned, his graphic novel, The Dark Knight Returns, is considered to be one of the definitive Batman stories. But in the last 10 to 15 years, there has been a noticeable and shocking decline in the quality of his work. In many ways, his more recent work has become a parody of his earlier work. This can be seen in The Dark Knight Strikes Again, and in more recent Batman series, All-Star Batman and Robin the Wonder Boy. Part of DC's All-Star imprint, a series of comic books meant to pair off some of the best comic creators with iconic characters in order to produce new interpretations that can both appeal to old fans and new readers, the story is a retelling of the origin of Batman's sidekick, Robin, Dick Grayson. The problem is that Batman is depicted as a criminally violent sociopath. He kills criminals, assaults Dick Grayson, and forces him to hunt for cave vermin for food. In the comic's most infamous moment, Batman introduces himself to Robin by saying, "Why are you so dense? Are you retarded or something? Who the hell do you think I am? I'm the goddamn Batman." The entire series has been decried for terrible characterization, subpar writing, and an inconsistent release schedule to boot. Number 4. Amazon's Attack. Amazon's Attack, numbers 1 through 6, March 2007 to August 2007. Even though she is both a feminist icon and one of DC's flagship heroes, few superheroes have endured more bad writing, editorial decisions, and mishandling than Wonder Woman. The principal problem is DC can never seem to figure out what to do with her character. Sometimes she's a warrior, sometimes a Greek god, sometimes an ambassador, and sometimes a sexy secret agent. Almost every new writer assigned to Wonder Woman has the bad habit of wiping away her entire past and supporting casts in order to revamp the character. Sometimes it works. George Perez, Greg Rucka, and Gail Simone have all done magnificent runs on the character that are worth reading by anyone interested in comics. However, these contributions to the character have been largely ignored or thrown away by subsequent writers and editors. The worst crime against Wonder Woman is the 2007 event Amazon's Attack. The plot behind the series is complex, convoluted, and incredibly stupid. But to summarize, the Amazons, the race of women warriors that Wonder Woman belongs to, attack Washington, D.C. in response for her illegal detention on the part of the US government. The story was a complete debacle. It was overly violent. In one scene, the Amazons kill unarmed children, and nonsensical. The Amazons are able to take down fighter jets with regular bows and arrows. But one of the worst parts is that Wonder Woman barely appears in the entire event. The whole thing was being advertised as a massive Wonder Woman event, but she only appears for a few pages. The entire mess of an event is seen as the low point of Wonder Woman's career. It was so bad that many fans literally mailed their copies to DC Comics editors. These 6 comics almost literally destroyed one of the most famous comic book characters in history. Number 3. Countdown to Final Crisis. Countdown, numbers 1 through 51, DC Universe, number 0, May 2007 to April 2008. Countdown to Final Crisis in many ways represents everything wrong with the comic book industry these days. Editors acting as writers, convoluted and self-contained stories, and, of course, bad writing. Countdown to Final Crisis was a 51-part series that was released 1 issue per week for an entire year. During that year, it crossed over with many other DC titles and set the stage for Final Crisis, the next large DC event. The problem was that it was a travesty. Essentially, the multiple writers of Countdown to Final Crisis had their hands tied and were forced to make changes to the story at the whims of DC Editor-in-Chief Dan Didio. Characters were killed off at random, the story made no sense unless you read every single tie-in, of which there were many, and it was generally inaccessible for people who did not have an encyclopedic knowledge of the DC universe and their characters. I couldn't explain everything wrong with this series if I wanted to. Number 2. Final Crisis. Final Crisis numbers 1 through 7, July 2008 to March 2009. Now, I'll be fair. Final Crisis is an incredibly controversial event that splits DC's fanbase in two. Some people hate it, others think it's one of the greatest comics ever written. The reason is that Final Crisis is one of the most confusing and opaque events ever written. It involves the evil, new god Darkseid's attempt to conquer reality, but to those who aren't an expert on DC Comics, reading it is like trying to read a foreign language for the first time. It is incredibly complex and occasionally frustrating, even to experienced readers. As I mentioned, to those who know the history, know the characters, and can pass writer Grant Morrison's unusual storytelling, Final Crisis is highly lauded. However, because of its complexity, Final Crisis alienated many DC fans and casual comic readers to the point that many see it as one of the worst things DC Comics has ever published. Number 1. Justice League Cry for Justice. Justice League Cry for Justice, numbers 1 through 7, September 2009 to April 2010. One of the biggest criticisms of the comic industry is the frequency with which characters are being killed off and brought back to life. It happens so often nowadays that killing off comic book characters seems like an exploitative and cheap way to attract readers and boost sales. One of the worst offenders of this trope is the recently limited series Justice League Cry for Justice. The series depicts the Justice League, still suffering from the deaths of Batman and Martian Manhunter as a result of Final Crisis, fighting against a plot that would lead to the destruction of several cities. They are able to stop most of the bombs, except for one. The resulting explosion destroys Star City, the home base of Green Arrow. The explosion killed millions, including, to the shock, horror, and disgust of fans, Leon Harper, the Red Arrow's daughter. It was a cruel, unnecessary turn of events that was played for shock value. Red Arrow would become so distraught that he would go insane. This was documented in the equally terrible Justice League The Rise of Arsenal. But as it stands, Justice League Cry for Justice was a mean-spirited event that killed off many beloved characters as a ploy to sell more comics. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to our channel by clicking the subscribe button in the top right. Our channel has loads of other awesome videos just like this.